Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
Today we're going to think outside the box just a little to see what we can discover when we step away from some of our everyday assumptions.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
I'm sure you've seen one of those puzzles where you're presented with a series of dots on a page, 3 rows of 3 dots in a perfect square. It's called the 9-dot problem, and the challenge is to connect all 9 dots by using just 4 connected lines. And of course, it looks like there's absolutely no way to do it until you realize that nobody actually said you had to stay inside any kind of boundary. The way we naturally organize our thoughts, we assume that the square formed by those 9 dots is the entire field of play, and subconsciously we draw a boundary around it. But when you dispense with the boundary and assume that the plane you're drawing on extends in every direction forever, suddenly it's possible you can connect all 9 dots with just 4 lines. It's an exercise we used to teach creative thinking, to encourage people to look at problems from a lot of different perspectives. And what we hope will happen is that we become very creative problem solvers. And then we can hope that we can apply those out-of-the-box thinking skills to the very worst difficulties we face as a human race. If we could just break out of the unspoken rules, then maybe we could finally find a way to defeat some of the horrible problems that have haunted us almost as long as we've been here. We barely realize that we are prisoners of our assumptions, and some of those assumptions may be preventing us from solving a bunch of very serious issues. Take, for example, the dead crow I found on my walk home from school one day, way back in ancient history when kids actually had to walk to school. The bird was out in the warm sun, and it was in pretty bad shape. I poked it with a stick, which suddenly caused hundreds of little maggots to spill out on the ground. Now, that was quite a find, because in the world I grew up in, those little larvae were incredibly useful because rainbow trout and Arctic grayling really liked them. But aside from that, those larvae also piqued my curiosity. How in the world did they get inside that crow? Now, you and I know the answer, and it's really pretty simple. Flies like to lay their eggs in meat so that the larvae will have something to eat when they hatch. But here's the thing. For thousands of years, we didn't understand that. It's hard to believe this, but there was a time in the not too distant past when we actually believed that life can spontaneously emerge from non-life. So, for example, consider this rather stunning assertion from the great philosopher Aristotle, who said, "So also some animals are produced from animals of a similar form." In other words, Aristotle's talking about natural reproduction. But then he says this: "The origin of others is spontaneous, and not from similar forms. From these and from plants are divided those which spring from putrid matter. This is the case with many insects." So, in other words, Aristotle taught that maggots come from meat. And for many long centuries after he made that erroneous observation, most of us believed in something known as spontaneous generation. We actually thought that life can just emerge from non-life. And it's easy to scoff at our stupidity back then because today we know better. But never forget that somewhere down the line, somebody's going to be making fun of some of our very best ideas, and they're going to think that we weren't very bright. But that's kind of the nature of assumptions. And if you and I didn't make assumptions, the act of living would become kind of tricky. If you and I had to analyze every single decision we ever made before we made it, it would lead to paralysis because there's not enough time in the day to analyze absolutely everything. And for a man who lived some 2,300 years ago, it didn't really matter how the maggots got there. All he needed to know was that a dead animal could provide him with bait and he could go fishing. In other words, the assumption worked. He didn't have to observe the flies laying their eggs in order to take advantage of his discovery. So, all day long, you and I make all kinds of completely unfounded assumptions about all kinds of things. I mean, just because the sun came up every single morning over the last 20,000 days of my life, except maybe the times I've been above the Arctic Circle, well, just because it came up faithfully every single day, there is no guarantee, 100%, that it's going to come up tomorrow. Based on my past experience, I just assume that it will. And it's a useful assumption because it helps me plan the day. And it gives me some level of assurance that life is stable and will continue. But at the end of the day, it's still just an assumption. You have no way of intellectually proving that. Just ask the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who exerted an unbelievable amount of energy trying to demonstrate how little we actually know for sure. And actually, he gave up on the notion of really understanding something we all take for granted: cause and effect. Hume denied that such a thing exists. But we can talk about David Hume some other day. You and I assume all kinds of things all the time. Assumptions that help us navigate our brief human lifespan. And those assumptions are a good thing until they're not. In the case of spontaneous generation, our assumptions probably kept us from conquering a lot of simple diseases. Back in 1668, Francesco Redi proved that spontaneous generation is impossible. And by 1859, about 2,000 years after Aristotle, Louis Pasteur took advantage of his discovery to give us pasteurization. It turns out, if you sterilize a medium like milk or meat and then seal it off from the outside world, you can stop the growth of undesirable forms like bacteria. And of course, that helped us develop the clean food sources and sterile operating theaters that you and I enjoy to this day. So, sometimes assumptions, as useful as they are in everyday life, are not a good thing. Like back in 1899, when Charles Duell, the commissioner of the American Patent Office, declared, "Everything that can be invented has been invented." Now, there were no devastating consequences because of his attitude, and he didn't really hurt anybody. But stop and think about everything that's been invented in the last 120 years, and I think you'll notice what a stupid thing that was to say. Or maybe consider the far more consequential assumption the Japanese made when Admiral Yamamoto and others decided that bombing Pearl Harbor would discourage the Americans from fighting them as they expanded further and further into the South Pacific. Yamamoto actually said that he wanted to, quote, fiercely attack and destroy the United States main fleet at the outset of the war so that the morale of the United States Navy and her people would sink to an extent that it could not be recovered. Man, oops. As you and I both know, the raid on Pearl Harbor had the opposite effect, and it led to a lot more catastrophic decisions, not the least of which was the world premiere of a devastating new technology, the A-bomb. So sometimes you've got to wonder just how much of world history has been driven by human assumptions. I know we like to deceive ourselves into thinking that we are perfectly rational beings all the time, and that ever since the Enlightenment, we've been operating from a platform of pure reason. But you and I both know that's not entirely true, and I'll be right back after this short message to pick up where we just left off.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
You know, I don't know why I didn't pay more attention to the works of Alexander Pope when I was a kid, but the youthful brain doesn't always appreciate the good things that our teachers are trying to share with us. So it really wasn't until I was an adult that I began to appreciate what a treasure Mr. Pope left to the English-speaking world. And just the other day, I was reading his essay on criticism when I came across something pretty amazing. Here's what it says. Music resembles poetry in each, are nameless graces which no methods teach, and which a master hand alone can reach, if where the rules not far enough extend, since rules were made but promote their end, some lucky license answers to the full the intent proposed that license is a rule. As you might have guessed from the title of the poem, he's talking about criticism. He's dividing the public up into creators and critics, and then he spends thousands of words talking about the behavior of those two different camps. And I guess I get a kick out of reading that because as a minister, I've been dealing with criticism most of my life. It really doesn't matter how careful I am when I talk about ideas, and I'm not always as careful as I could be, but invariably, I'll get an angry letter or two from somebody who's utterly outraged by something I said. And the advent of social media has only made this problem worse because we now seem to think that every opinion out there deserves an angry rebuttal, and if we're really mad, we'll try to get somebody canceled. But here in this poem at this point, Alexander Pope touches on something really important. It's out-of-the-box thinking. There's no question that a successful civilization has to have rules, guidelines for how things should be done. So, for example, if we didn't have rules about driving on the left, the freeways would end up being a bigger mess than they already are. If we didn't have unspoken rules for standing in line, then going shopping would be a social nightmare like it is on Black Friday when people stand outside all night and then trample each other the moment the doors open. So yes, rules are very important. And in this poem, Mr. Pope is discussing the art of writing. When you and I took English classes back in school, we were taught the rules of English grammar, and those were very important because without the rules, there would be a breakdown in communication. We need those rules in order to understand each other. But then, of course, as it is with English itself, there are exceptions to the rule that can prove to be beneficial, like you see with the poetry of E. Cummings, which, if you've ever seen it, is an absolute grammatical nightmare. But somehow it works. It's kind of beautiful. In fact, it demonstrates an amazing level of linguistic genius. Or maybe consider the music of Dizzy Gillespie, who always puffed out his cheeks when he played the trumpet. Ask any first-year trumpet student and they'll tell you you're not supposed to do that. It's horrible form and it'll keep you from developing a healthy embouchure. But there's no denying that an outlier like Dizzy Gillespie is better than all the rest of us combined, even though he tossed out some of the rules. Now that's kind of what Alexander Pope was driving at. He's telling us that rules are very important, but you can miss a lot of opportunities if you decide to be legalistic about it. As somebody once said, rules are meant to be broken. But breaking the rules does not become an advantage until after you've mastered the rules, until you understand why they were established in the first place. Which brings me to the uncomfortable subject of spiritual deconstruction. Right now in the West, we appear to be going through a time when absolutely everything is being questioned. And there seems to be this desire to smash a lot of social conventions without trying to understand why those social conventions were established in the first place. Of course, sometimes questioning everything can be good because there are some unspoken rules that used to make sense once upon a time, but now they don't. I'm reminded of an old story you may have heard about the Tsar of Russia taking a walk through the imperial garden only to discover a sentry standing guard in a remote corner where there was nothing to guard. When he asked the soldier why he was standing there, the guard replied, "I have no idea why, I'm just following orders." So the Tsar went home to search through the official records, and it turns out, if the story is true, that once upon a time Catherine the Great had a very rare and expensive rose bush growing in that location, so she posted a guard there to keep it safe. But then Catherine died, and eventually so did the rose bush, and the guard that was supposed to guard it, well, that order was still in effect. And sometimes there are conventions we could do away with because they don't make sense, like some of those obsolete laws that are still officially on the books to this day, but they actually stopped being useful a long time ago. In fact, I just discovered there was an old law on the books in a little town called Severance here in Colorado, just up the road, and that law made it illegal to throw snowballs all the way up until the year 2019, when a third grade boy successfully challenged it in court. Obviously, there had to be a reason the law was created in the first place, because it's hard to imagine that the mayor of Severance just arbitrarily decided, "I don't like snowballs." So yeah, there are rules we could probably safely get rid of. But in recent history, it seems like there's a growing movement to do away with everything, just deconstruct Western civilization. And that might be okay, but not if we don't understand why the boundaries were established in the first place. Let me give you a bit of a touchy example, and I know some of you will write me off as a social Luddite for this, but I'm okay with that. For a very long time, Western society operated by a basic set of moral principles governing human sexuality. Now, I'm well aware that no generation has ever faithfully lived by all those principles, but there was a time when we said, hey, it's a good idea to wait for marriage. And that was rooted not just in Judeo-Christian principles, it was, but it was also rooted in good common sense. It just made sense that it's easier to raise children in this world with a family than without. But then came the sexual revolution of the 60s, and the landscape started to shift. Now, not everything that happened in the 60s was bad, because there was some room for improvement when it came to our attitudes. But we also started to deconstruct sexual mores without asking ourselves why they were put there in the first place. And just to be clear, what you do in your bedroom, that's your business. I don't want the church to start writing laws about your private conduct. But I do find myself questioning whether or not our deconstruction of the traditional nuclear family has been a good thing. Which brings me to a somewhat amusing post I read the other day while scrolling through that vast treasure of half-baked ideas that is Twitter. It was posted after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, a decision that caused a predictable firestorm. And I'm not about to tackle the subject of abortion because we don't have that kind of time today, but imagine my amusement when I stumbled across a post that inadvertently, almost accidentally, spelled out the reasons for holding to a traditional view of marriage. What did it say? Well, you're going to have to wait to find out because it's time for another quick break. But when I come back, I'll show you what I found on Twitter, which is now called X.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
When the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in the first part of 2022, it caused no end of debate in the bombastic halls of social media. Abortion has always been a contentious issue here in the West, and so I fully expected to find name-calling and angry tweets. But then I saw this post, and I think it was actually on Reddit maybe instead of Twitter, and it was written by a gal who was upset by the new restrictions in her state, so she started talking to her female friends. Here's what she said. We all agreed to a pact, no having sex with any men until he had proven himself a capable provider and until that man has signed a contract written on paper agreeing to stay with us and support us if we get pregnant. We started drafting an actual contract and we're planning on sending it to a lawyer to make sure it's legit. At this point, I am completely done with men who want to hook up and leave. Well, you know what that sounds like? That sounds an awful lot like the contract I signed with my wife more than 3 decades ago. A contract known as marriage. In at least one person's mind, the social conventions of yesterday are starting to make an awful lot of good sense. Which brings me back to the subject of rules. Sometimes, as Alexander Pope pointed out, we all benefit when somebody starts to think outside of the box. If Wilbur and Orville Wright hadn't been thinking outside the box, it's entirely possible it would still take me several weeks to travel from the West Coast to the East Coast. If Mozart hadn't defied the conventions of his day, we wouldn't have the incredible treasury of music that he left to us. If Rosa Parks had not defied an unjust law, civil rights in this country might not be where they are. So yeah, there are moments of human genius when somebody realizes the rules don't make sense. But not always. Sometimes we delude ourselves into thinking that we're having a moment of genius when all that's really happening is a moment of selfish ambition, a moment of self-indulgence. We decide that we don't like the rules because we personally find them to be inconvenient. And that seems to be all the rage now in the 21st century. Here in the United States, we place a very high value on individualism. And rightfully so, because most of us are not in favor of morally regulating our neighbors. But I do want to question why we seem to praise everybody who deconstructs our social conventions, even when their so-called achievements prove to be questionable. So, for example, when it comes to art, it seems that shock value now outweighs any actual intellectual or aesthetic value. You might remember the accolades that one so-called performance artist got when he crushed a live rat in front of an audience to produce a visceral reaction. And there were art critics calling that magnificent. And we're finding the same thing happening now in the entertainment industry. And from where I sit, it almost feels like there's not much difference anymore between the circus of Rome with its insatiable appetite for violence and bloodshed and the ever-increasing savagery and decadence we find streaming into our homes. We find ourselves celebrating things that would have shocked our ancestors and abandoning the principles and hard work that enabled them to provide you and me with a really exceptional place to live. I'm reminded of a famous passage written by Paul back in the 1st century where he said this, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. And from such people, turn away." I guess what I want to say is this. Not every act of independence is genius. Not every act of social deconstruction is brave or progressive. Sometimes it's just attention-seeking. It's our selfish human nature on display, and it might be time to remind ourselves why the rules were put there in the first place before it's too late. There's a verse in the book of Proverbs, the book renowned for its wisdom, that really sums up what I'm trying to get across. It goes like this: "Do not remove the ancient landmark which your fathers have set." In the ancient land of Israel, property markers were unbelievably important. They delineated your family's inheritance. They marked the place that was set aside for you in the land of promise. And you'll find the original regulations regarding these property markers over in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says this: "You shall not remove your neighbor's landmark, which the men of old have set, in your inheritance which you will inherit in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess." In the world where that regulation was written, this was a really big deal. Your very livelihood depended on the reliability of those markers, and it was strictly forbidden to mess with them. In essence, the wise man is reminding us there's a reason our ancestors put those boundaries where they did, and we'd be fools to mess with them until we understand exactly what they are and why they were put there. Okay, time for one last break, and then I'll be right back to wrap things up.
Retirement planning can be a stressful process, but it doesn't have to be. The friendly people at the Voice of Prophecy can walk you through the entire process and explain all of your options based on your specific needs. Whether you'd like to set up a trust for income or make a gift that will benefit your loved ones and change lives through the Voice of Prophecy, we're here to help. To learn more, call 1-800-348-5993.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Okay, up to now, I've been talking about the boundaries and markers that our ancestors established in order to safeguard civilization. The unspoken rules that are still there underneath our rather successful culture, or at least it's been successful up till now. And maybe I should close today with an appeal to some of God's boundaries. You know, things like the 10 Commandments. I know a lot of people view these things as religious fables, unnecessary restrictions on our liberty. But I'd encourage you to maybe give them one more read, because you might just discover these rules make really good sense. I mean, you shall not murder and you shall not steal. Those seem obvious to us, even though we appear to be living in a time when life is cheap and personal property doesn't seem to mean very much anymore. Honestly, I believe that right now we're reaping the consequences of out-of-the-box thinking, but the wrong kind. The problem is that we no longer seem to know exactly where the box is or was. You're not coloring outside the lines if there are no lines in the first place. That's not creativity. And unless you understand where the boundaries are, where the box is, you cannot possibly think outside of it. And maybe that's the best summary I can give for what I think is going on right now. And maybe it's too late. As one philosopher told me a few years ago as he packed up and left this country and moved somewhere else forever, because he said there is no coming back. Maybe he's onto something. Or maybe there is a coming back. And again, I know that some of you don't really believe the Bible is divinely inspired, but before you assume that it's not, maybe give it another look. Try reading it to examine what it says about human beings and their penchant for incredibly self-destructive behavior. Maybe take a look at what it says about the condition, the nature of the human heart, and then look at what it says about the God who made us in the first place. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, God says in Isaiah chapter 55, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Now, if I'm perfectly honest, there have been times when I've read what the Bible says and I've told myself, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. But the older I get and the longer time goes, the more I'm starting to see that a world untethered from God is exactly what God said it was going to be. It's suffering, pain, and death. So now I've come to the point where most of what I read in the Scriptures actually makes absolute perfect sense to me. I'm starting to see that the one who made me understands how my mind works far better than I do. I'm starting to see that God didn't write a bunch of rules to make my life harder. He did it for my good. I mean, look at the mess we're making out of this world. And then you tell me, just how well have human beings managed this place? Why is it that all of our best ideas have all these horrible unintended consequences? And can we ever trust that somebody's going to come along, somebody who is perfectly selfless, somebody who can't be corrupted, and fix this place? Well, actually, that's already happened. And you find that rather amazing story in this book. Now, the things I don't understand, I've come to believe that God knows what He's talking about when it comes to that stuff too. So before you join the crowd that seems eager to rip everything down for the sake of ripping it down, maybe, take a deep breath, stop, and think. Ask yourself, how did we get here? Why? What's really going on? Did we really fail in the past when we had moral boundaries? Or are we failing right now? Thanks for joining me. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been another episode of Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.